Hello, folks. Welcome to the first session of our Students of the Grassland webinar series. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Heidi Wismath, and I'm humbled to be joining you from the beautiful and today overcast but lovely traditional, ancestral, and very unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan people and the chosen home of the Métis Nation. The grasslands in this territory have been maintained with great care through fire and that irreplaceable lived understanding of the land that has been rooting here since time immemorial. And I'm just deeply grateful to be a guest here on these lands and to continue to learn what it means to live in reciprocity in this place from the knowledge of my host nation, the Syilx Nation. So Limlint, Morantang, and thank you to all of the folks who are making this gathering today possible, very much including you. We have a lot of folks in the room today, nearly 100. So I'd love to hear where everyone is joining from. Please feel free to share that in the chat, which leads me into some housekeeping. If you look down at the bottom of your screen, you can feel free to use the chat box for general discussion or networking. The closed captioning link is available on the far side far side. So just click that CC button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like a live transcription. You can submit your questions ongoing throughout the webinar in the Q&A box, and you can also upvote questions that you're interested in hearing answered. You can also raise your hand at the end during our question period if you would like to speak during the Q&A, but your video will not be showing as far as I know, so don't bother putting on pants or fixing your hair or whatever it is. Wow, it's great to see those introductions rolling into the chat. And I'd love to just take a moment here to introduce the Grasslands Conservation Council of BC. I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the GCC, and our work is to protect and promote the extraordinary value of BC's grasslands, from the rich ecological diversity to their deep cultural significance, and of course, their essential role in our economy and society. We really take pride in being BC's only organization exclusively focused on protecting those grasslands through education, research, and hands-on conservation efforts. And that's why we're collaborating to bring you this really exciting webinar series showcasing these emerging student researchers in grasslands conservation. So this series is all about highlighting those graduate and undergraduate students, and we hope that the initiative will connect those students with practitioners and professionals in rangeland management, perhaps such as yourself, and share their innovative research with the broader conservation community and just help foster that collaboration between academic institutions and conservation organizations. And speaking of collaboration, this is just a perfect segue into thanking the Thompson-Nicola Conservation Collaborative for their invaluable support in supporting this series by providing technical and for hosting us on their Zoom platform. So the TNCC is just a beautiful example of collaboration efforts and knowledge sharing in the Thompson watershed. And you can learn more about what they're up to by visiting their website, which I am just going to post in the chat, along with a couple of other links for your reference. I'd also like to extend our gratitude to the BC chapter of the Pacific Northwestern section of the Society for Range Management, woo, what a mouthful, for their collaboration in this webinar series. And today I'm delighted to introduce our SRM co-host for the session, Ashley Todd, who is a past president and is the current secretary of the BC chapter. I'm just going to pass it over to Ashley now.
Perfect. Can everybody hear me? Thank you so much, Heidi. So my name's Ashley Todd. I'm the outgoing president with the Society for Range Management BC chapter, and also the current secretary. I'm joining today from the Williams Lake area, the traditional territory of the Northern Secwepemc people. I'd like to take a moment to introduce the Society for Range Management, affectionately coined SRM. SRM is a dynamic community of professionals, students, and ranchers dedicated to advancing the science and practice of managing rangelands. Whether you're a researcher, land manager, or enthusiast, SRM fosters collaboration and innovation to promote sustainable land stewardship, conserve biology, and enhance the health of rangeland ecosystems. Through education, research, advocacy, and hands-on management, SRM works to balance the needs of wildlife, livestock, and the land itself. If you're interested in joining SRM, I'll post our local BC chapter email in the chat. I don't have the emails for all of the different sections, so if you're in Alberta, there's a there's a Intermountain section there, and so we can always connect you with somebody from that area. Um, with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Katherine Johnson. Katherine Johnson is a master's student in agricultural, food, and nutritional sciences at the University of Alberta. She specializes in rangeland and wildlife research. As an environmental scientist and agrologist in training, Katherine brings extensive experience in grassland management and conservation. Katherine graduated from the University of Alberta in 2022 with a bachelor's degree in environmental and conservation sciences, majoring in wildlife and rangeland resource management. Katherine's current research examines the response of invasive plants to prescribed fire and various herbicide treatments in southeastern British Columbia. This work, conducted in partnership with the Kikomun Creek Provincial Park, and Katherine, please correct my pronunciation if I butcher this, knuqⱡi'it First Nation. The Katherine is aiming to address challenges in managing invasive species while managing for traditional land management practices. Katherine's expertise is highlighted by her achievement at the Society for Range Management annual general meeting, where she placed first in both the undergraduate range management exam and combined plant ID categories. Thank you so much, Katherine, and we look forward to hearing your presentation.
All right, thank you. I can share my screen now if that's all right. Can everybody see that? It looks fine.
Yeah, we can see you, Katherine. Go ahead.
All right, thanks. So yeah, like I said, I'm Katherine Johnson with the U of A and also Tennis Conservation Services, which is helping a lot with this research. And I'm looking at the invasive plant responses to prescribed fire and herbicide treatments in southeastern BC. So as far as the where goes, we've got two separate study sites. One is at Kikomun Creek Provincial Park, and the other is at knuqⱡi'it First Nation. They are both fairly similar environments, but a couple of key differences that come up in the research. So the basic goals of this research, we want to know what will happen to invasive species after burning, what will happen to the native species after burning, how will herbicides impact the invasive species and the native species, and importantly, how will the herbicides interact with the prescribed burning? So for a couple of reasons, this is a unique question because the herbicides may behave differently. We know the invasive plants behave differently under burning conditions. So like I said, two separate locations, Kikomun Creek Provincial Park and knuqⱡi'it. Kikomun Creek Provincial Park, we're testing two broadleaf herbicides, and knuqⱡi'it, we're testing a broadleaf and a pre-emergent herbicide. That's because we've got some different weeds growing at each of these sites. At Kikomun, it's mostly potentilla and St. John's wort, Hypericum perforatum. And we've actually got more invasive grasses at our other site. So because of that, the herbicides we're using are slightly different. They both have very short fire return intervals, but it's somewhat longer at Kikomun Creek Provincial Park. So the biogeoclimatic subzones we're working with, a lot of you are going to be quite familiar with this already. IDF DM2, cooler and moister than our other one. It's a mosaic of forest, grasslands, and shrublands. There's a lot of Douglas fir in the overstory. The understory is dominated by pine grass, arnica, showy aster, Oregon grape. And then for grasses, we've got a lot of blue bunch wheatgrass, fescue, arrowleaf balsam root, and juniper. So there's lots of variation in this zone. along moisture and elevational gradients. The other one we are looking at, and I believe this is where all of our study kits are actually in, is the IDF XX2 Kootenai Dry Mild Interior Douglas Fir. So the forests were historically described as open and savanna-like. So we saw a lot of isolated trees and grasslands. More lodgepole pine. In good condition, the grasslands are dominated by rough fescue, Idaho fescue, and blue bunch wheatgrass. When they're in poorer condition, you'll see more June grass, Kentucky bluegrass, and needle grasses. That's on heavily grazed grassland sites. But as we mentioned with the other one, this varies a lot along elevational and moisture gradients. Our target species, we've got a few different invasives that we are primarily looking at. I'm going to start off with the annual bromes, the Bromus tinctorum and Bromus japonicus. They're different species. They behave quite similarly, so I've lumped them together. They're both winter annual grasses. They were introduced from Eurasia in the 1800s, introduced to the United States first, and they've spread. They can form very dense stands and compete with native species. So they have large seed banks. They produce a lot of seed. They form dense litter layers that are prone to fire. Awns can injure animals' mouths. So you can see on the picture on the left there, there's fairly long awns on those seeds, and those awns can hurt animals when they eat them. It has a positive relationship with fire, so both of these species will increase after burning. The next one we're looking at is two invasive potentilla species, Potentilla recta and Potentilla inclinata. That's gray cinquefoil and sulfur cinquefoil. They're both perennials, they're forbs, also native to Eurasia and North Africa. They were introduced sometime before 1900, found in Western North America by 1950. We don't have really good data on exactly where and when they came. They resprout from the base after a disturbance. The relationship with fire isn't entirely clear. It seems like they might prefer fall fires to spring fires, but they do seem to have a somewhat positive relationship with fire. And they are pretty much avoided by grazing animals. So you can see in that bottom picture there exactly how dense the stands of this can get and can crowd out a lot of the native plants. And the other species we are targeting is St. John's wort, Hypericum perforatum. This is also a perennial forb native to Eurasia and North Africa. This one was introduced as an ornamental and a medicinal herb. So people used to grow it in their gardens. And similar to our other ones, it grows in dense patches and outcompetes native vegetation. It can spread very effectively by root and has very high seed production. So because of those deep roots, that vegetative spread, it also has a positive relationship with fire. So all of these after burn will tend to increase in density. So at Kikomun Creek Provincial Park, like I said, we're using two broadleaf herbicides because at Kikomun Creek, we don't have quite as many invasive grasses. It's mostly the broadleaves that are the problem. And we'll get to exactly what's in these herbicides a bit later, but Reclaim and Clearview are the two being used. And so they've already been applied. They were applied back in 2023, and in 2024, we did our burn. So subsequent to that, it's just going to be annual monitoring. Our other site, this is where we have our pre-emergent herbicide for those invasive annual grasses. So the broadleaf, we have Reclaim, and the pre-emergent is Indaziflam. The herbicides were applied in 2024, and hopefully we'll be burning there soon. And yeah, we're keeping up annual monitoring there as well. So some of the vegetation that we would expect to see in knuqⱡi'it, we would expect to see a lot of fescues, rough fescue and Idaho fescue, quite a bit of blue bunch wheatgrass, and some needle grasses, and a wide variety of forbs, a lot of asters, balsam root, yarrow, lemonweed, and one rare plant, Spalding's campion, which is pretty unique to that area. As far as what's actually found, the grasslands there are in poorer condition. They've been historically overgrazed. So we see a lot more needle grasses. Hesperostypa comata is kind of the dominant grass there. We also see a lot of June grass. Non-natives, we have Poa compressa and Poa pratensis. And we've got a lot of 6-week fescue. There's a couple other non-native species in there, like dense silky bent. And then we have our annual bromes. And forbs, we've got again some non-native forbs, some native forbs, and our sulfur cinquefoil. Kikomun Creek is a little bit different. It's more dominated by pine grass and bunch grasses. And we'll see a lot of Oregon grape and birch leaf spirea and blue bunch wheatgrass and antelope bitterbrush. So that antelope bitterbrush is one of their big shrub encroachment problems at Kikomun Creek. And the picture on the right here is just June grass because BC has fuzzy June grass. Alberta doesn't have that, and I really like fuzzy June grass. So for herbicides, why we are using herbicides? There's a few benefits for rangeland applications. They can be used where mechanical methods won't work if you have poor terrain. So this picture on the right is from Alberta, but you'll see a lot of similar landscapes in BC. You can see a steep slope like this. There's going to be very limited options for controlling weeds somewhere like here. Herbicides can kill sprouting plants that won't be removed by top removal. So just going and picking a plant will not remove it totally, but spraying it might. It's quite fast. You can very quickly get rid of your weed problem, and there's low labor requirements. 1 or 2 people can do quite a bit of effective labor. Selective application. So unlike something like mechanical disturbance, you're going to be selecting which species you're taking out. And because of that, we'll get reduced soil erosion. So instead of taking all of the plants out, we're only taking the ones we don't like. So the herbicides being used for this project are in 3 different groups. Group 2 and 4 are broadleaf herbicides. Group 2 is ALS inhibitors. These prevent production of amino acids. So that means that either the weeds don't emerge at all, they don't sprout, or they're stunted when they do sprout. And it reduces plant growth after it's already started growing. Our group 4 are synthetic auxins. These ones are a little bit different. They cause uncontrolled growth, so the weeds have twisted and distorted stems and heads, and basically the plants grow themselves to death. So our first herbicide used at Kikomun is Reclaim 2. Said this one reduces broadleaf weeds, designed for control in rangelands and pastures. It has 2 active ingredients. Reclaim, well, 2 active parts to it, I guess. So Reclaim 2A is group 2, aminopyrrolid and metsorelferol methyl, and Reclaim 2B is group 4, 2,4-D. You can apply this as broadcast or spot spraying, and it prevents the growth of plants and prevents them from making new proteins, like I mentioned on the previous slide. So ideally, you want to apply this when target plants are actively growing. It has a residual of 24 months, so that means for about 2 years after spraying, your weeds should be controlled. There's no grazing restrictions, so animals can eat right off of this without being harmed, but it may damage some desirable vegetation, so that's part of what we are looking at. Should not be applied in the drip line of desirable trees. It could harm them. And interestingly for our research, drought or excessive heat may decrease efficacy. So when we're combining this with prescribed burns, we want to be looking pretty closely at that. So on the right here, you see our application pattern. This is just from a satellite picture. You can see pretty clearly where a side-by-side had driven through the plots to apply the herbicides. And Clearview, which is quite similar to Reclaim. It does not have the addition of 2,4-D, but it also has the residual of 24 months. You also need to target plants when they're actively growing. There's still no grazing restrictions, but still that risk of damage to desirable vegetation. So, like I said, fairly similar, but Clearview does not have the addition of the 2,4-D. And Indaziflam is our other herbicide. This one is only being applied at knuqⱡi'it. It controls, it says broadleaf weeds. It does not control those. It controls annual grasses. It's designed for control in rangelands and pastures. It is group 29, so it's a totally different mode of action than our broadleaf herbicides, and it can be applied as broadcast or spot spraying. It is a pre-emergent, so it is applied before plants germinate. So the broadleaf ones we looked at, you want to be applying when those plants are actively growing. This one you want to apply before they've started growing. It inhibits biosynthesis, so it prevents plants from growing. So shortly after they germinate, they will just die. You should never even really see them come out of the ground. There's a couple brand names for this, Rejuvra and Esplanade. That is not yet registered for rangeland use in Canada. It can be used in industrial settings, but not rangeland. This one has up to 4 years of residual effects, but the residual effects are still very much in question. We don't know how long they're going to last in an environment like this. This is a fairly new herbicide. It's probably less than 10 years since it's being used. So there's a lot of questions about exactly how long it's going to last. It shouldn't affect perennial vegetation that has already started growing. It can affect things that are just starting to germinate. One of the problems with this one, if you have areas with heavy invasive pressure, patches of bare ground might appear, and the bare ground is going to be another vector for invasion. So you could have multiple invasive species moving in when you just got rid of the old ones. It only operates in the very top layer of the soil, but that means excessive litter can affect efficacy. So if you have really heavy litter layer, then the herbicide might not be able to reach the top layer of the soil, and you're not going to get very good control. It doesn't move very well with water, so it's hard to wash it through places. A little bit of basic site setup. This is for Kikomun Creek. You see it's divided into 4 blocks, and the burn goes through the center. So BC Wildfire could really just set the fire and let it go. And we have buffers in between all of these so that we aren't burning what we don't want to burn, we're not spraying what we don't want to spray. And yeah, each of these blocks is 6 by 6 meters. And in each of those blocks, we have 4 monitoring plots set up. knuqⱡi'it is a little bit different because we have the addition of that pre-emergent. So when we are looking at Kikomun Creek, we don't mix the reclaim and the clearview because they both do essentially the same thing. Whereas at our other site, we do want to mix the pre-emergent and the broadleaf to see if we can control both types of weeds. So we have a few more replications. The plots are a little bit bigger, but the same concept goes for the prescribed burn and where it goes through. And this is just a close-up of our 6 by 6 plots. The 1 by 1, that one is in yellow, we use to assess shrub cover or to count weeds, and the 50 by 50 centimeter plot we use to assess grass and forb cover and to count weeds. So depending on how many weeds we have to count, we change our plot size because we don't want to be counting thousands and thousands of little cheatgrass stems in a 1 by 1 meter frame. So for anybody really interested in herbicides, this is the application. The tank mix information for how much we were applying, the sprayer details, the temperature, and the relative humidity. So you notice when we were spraying the reclaim, the temperature was a lot higher because we were applying on growing plants, whereas the Esplanade we were applying pre-emergence. So this was applied in the fall. Because they're winter annuals, they're going to germinate hopefully, in either the fall or the spring. So we want to get that herbicide on there before they have a chance to germinate. And Kikomun Creek, going to be quite similar. Use of reclaim, it was a little bit cooler when this was applied, but again, very, very similar application strategies. And now we get into the really fun stuff. This is information about the burn. So like I mentioned before, the historical fire return interval was probably 25 to 50 years. It might have been a lot shorter in areas. In some of these grasslands, it might have been as short as 4 or 5 years between burns. This caused a mosaic of grassland, shrubland, and forest. But suppression of fire, so we haven't had burns in a lot of these places in a long time, it increases the forest cover and reduces wildlife habitat values. So when we're looking at heavy shrub cover, the elk might not like to graze there as much. And as they graze less, the shrub cover increases, so wildlife habitat decreases. And like I was explaining with the broadleaf herbicides, we are a little bit worried that the residual activity of the herbicides may be affected by burning. So those broadleafs are pretty specific about the fact heat can affect their efficacy. So maybe that 2-year residual will be reduced significantly after burning. And really, we need the herbicides to be working after burning because those invasive plants that we looked at earlier make a big comeback after a burn. So just an idea of how complicated some of this can be. Our burn at Kikomun Creek took place on April 2nd, 2024. And this is just a list of all of the data that BC Wildfire had to be looking at to make sure conditions were just right so that it's a safe burn, but an effective burn. And yeah, the fine fuel moisture code, duff moisture code, drought code, initial spread index, buildup index, and fire weather index all had to be within a specified range before this fire could take place. So it happens very fast, and everybody's kind of waiting tense to see if we're going to be able to burn today or not. This is the fire in action. You see, like, there's areas that it looks more smoldering. There's not a lot of large flames, and then there's areas where the flames are pretty tall, so you can see it's climbing up a tree there. And ideally, it takes out the shrubs, so the shrubs should burn pretty hot and disappear, but it should leave the grasses, the perennial grasses at least, alone. So this is a picture from immediately post-fire. You can see it's not a totally uniform burn. I believe it's knuqⱡi'it in the right picture that just didn't seem to really care. The fire went over it and it stayed green and went back to normal. But a lot of the other things were really burned down to ground level. There's still a lot of litter layer over this, so it's not bare ground by any means. And there's still a lot of living plants in there. So yeah, this is immediately post-fire. Shrub impacts immediately post-fire. You can see the difference it made. Interestingly, we had a lot of antelope bitterbrush die off for some reason right before the burn. It must have been a tough winter for it. A lot of it was either dead or remaining dormant late into the season, but it burned quite well. So these aren't the same site, but they looked very similar before the burn. And yeah, you can see a lot of that shrub cover is pretty much gone. So this picture I took about 2 weeks after the fire, and it's showing some of the grass regrowth from those native perennial bunch grasses. Burns caused less damage to perennial grasses than to shrubs and trees, and spring burns do less damage to grasses than fall burns do. And this biomass can actually increase in grasslands after burning. So 3 years after burning in BC, you can see increases in the biomass produced by grasses and forbs. Yeah, you can see 2 weeks after burning, and this bunch grass is already trying to make a comeback. There's a lot of green coming up. Approximately 2 months post-fire for these native grass recoveries. Left is an unburned plot and right is a burned plot. And yeah, this is 2 months after the burn, and that grass on the right would have looked kind of like this, and it has already resprouted to there. So they do come back quite quickly. It's very impressive. Shrubs somewhat less so. You see 2 months after the fire, they're still blackened. There's not a lot of growth going on, but the forbs are starting to come back. You can see a little bit of green coming on that shrub, so some of them might survive the fire. But the invasives is what we really want to be looking at with this research. Immediately, like the 2 months post-fire, we weren't seeing a lot of invasives coming back, but the burn plots were still pretty black. The one exception is Poa compressa. The compressed bluegrass really seemed to thrive post-fire. Like a lot of what you see in this picture here is compressed bluegrass. Like there was more of it there than before the burn. So again, we're waiting to see exactly what those potentillas and the St. John's worts are going to be doing. Post-burn, we put up electric fences because, like I mentioned, the grass comes back quite quickly. It comes back green, and the elk really like to camp out on it. So we put up electric fences. We kept them up for a couple months. I'm kind of surprised they kept out the elk as well as they did. They looked a little bit flimsy, but they did a really good job. And yeah, the burn plot stayed pretty much elk-free, which is exactly what we were hoping for. So a couple things that I'm really interested in seeing with this research is the fate of some of our native annuals. So especially on knuqⱡi'it, we have Vulpia octiflora and Plantigo patagonica. These are both annual species, and they're probably going to be affected negatively by the indaziflam treatment. And in some areas that, especially that Vulpia, is almost the dominant grass species. There's also some non-native species that aren't, strictly speaking, invasive weeds. We don't usually worry about them too much, but they are non-native. Things like Veronica verna and Myasota stricta. So this picture on the right, you can see the cheatgrass kind of in the top layer, that really fuzzy looking brome, and then a whole lot of Vulpia in the kind of understory of the grassland. So there's a whole bunch of little tiny annual grasses in there. And again, this is the dominant species in a whole bunch of these grasslands. So is it going to be taken out completely? What is going to come back? The other major native grass species on knuqⱡi'it is the needle and thread grass, and that one should be unaffected. So it should come back just fine after herbicide application. So that is about all I have for presentation, but I left quite a bit of time for questions if anybody has them. So yeah, a lot of people to thank. This is some pretty complicated research. There's a lot going on, and a lot of people have helped out. So I'll just flip back to a nice fire picture because that's what we all want to look at.
Thank you so much, Catherine. This was great. So we're going to open up the floor to questions. So if anybody is interested in just unmuting their mic and coming on, like Heidi said at the beginning, or if you want to post your questions in the question box, I can read them aloud and ask Catherine them on your behalf.
I saw some that were in the chat, but I can't see the chat now.
In the chat, people were asking about the recording. Oh yeah, so Heidi says just make sure you raise your hand and she will unmute you if you do want to ask a question aloud.
We do have several questions in the Q&A box. Maybe I can just voice some of them, and Catherine can
I
answer
saw
for
the
us.
wrong spot. I'm so sorry, Heidi. I was looking like in the actual chat. That is my bad. Okay. So we'll start with the ones that are in the Q&A box. So our first question is from Don Gayton, and his question says, did I understand correctly that there is a problem of antelope brush encroachment?
So at Kikomun Creek, yes, they're a little bit worried about the amount of antelope brush that's coming in. Both that and the trees, there's a lot more of them than there used to be. Yeah, the antelope bitterbrush isn't a problem. Most like it's natural there. It's supposed to be there. It's just when fire has been excluded for a long time, some of the grasslands kind of get taken over a little bit.
Don does have his hand up, Heidi, if you wanted to unmute him so he could follow up on his question.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'm just curious because antelope brush is sort of a threatened species here in the South Okanagan. I know it's much more common in the Rocky Mountain Trench, um, but it's really hard to get a handle on whether it is fire sensitive and fire dependent or somewhere in between. Because certainly here in the Okanagan, it gets shaded out as there's ponderosa pine encroachment. But I didn't realize that it could be an encroachment species itself.
Yeah, and a lot of Kikomun Creek, it's pretty thick. There's a lot of it.
Interesting. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. Our next question is from Randy Harris, and he asks, did you evaluate burn intensity impact?
We didn't have any really strict guidelines for burn intensity. We kind of looked, bare ground is mostly what we were looking at. So we recorded after the burn, is there a lot of bare ground present? Is there still a lot of litter present? And yeah, photographic, but nothing nothing super technical on the fire intensity impact.
It looks like Randy has his hand up, just if he wanted to follow up with his question.
Okay, yeah, just a question there. There is actually a numeric score from 1 to 5 that's actually fairly easy to follow. It still might be possible the year after the burn, but 5 is unburnt, and 1, you burnt it right back to the Stone Age. And from looking at what you've done here, these are pretty light impacts based on your burn, because sometimes if you get a heavier burn, it has a very different effect on the plants. So it might confound your results. But if you're just to use that, I could send you the reference if you like.
Sure.
Yeah, because that would probably help, because it can confound it. And just to follow up something that Don said, like looking at your pictures, quite often when we do these burns, we are trying to kill antelope brush so it'll resprout. So that resprouting that you showed, I'm going, oh, that's actually good. That's actually what we want to see. We just top kill it so it resprouts from the base, because there's a theory going around that the antelope brush in the Okanagan, it might be a different subspecies, but I've also heard the counter thought that if you let it go too long, the antelope brush gets quite large, and then when you burn it, it kills the growing points within the plant, so it doesn't resprout. The fact that this is resprouting, I see that as actually being a good thing. So, anyways, I'll send you the reference.
Well, and like we said, for some reason, the antelope brush had a big die-off the winter before.
Well,
if it was just cold, I'm not sure what was going on, but it was a lot of very dead shrubs.
Well, it's not well studied, but the guys who used to do the burns before me said that if it starts to die off, that's a good time to burn it so you can rejuvenate it. So it might fit in. Like if you have about 25% of the plants are dead, you really, really need to burn it to rejuvenate the plants. But the fact that you've seen that actually factors into the effectiveness of your results. Like this is actually going to be very interesting to see, because it sounds like it needs a burn. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Randy. Our next question is from Dave Ralph, and he asks, why did you not use the maximum per hectare rate of Clearview, which is 230 grams a hectare?
I'm not sure if
gallons a hectare, sorry.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can answer exactly why the rate of Clearview was chosen, especially at Kikomun Creek. Herbicide rates and types were kind of being chosen based on public impacts. So, you know, historically they've sprayed in the fall, even though that's not the most effective time, just because they want to avoid peak tourism season and things like that. So I'm not exactly sure about the rationale for the selection of the rates, but we also wanted to keep them kind of close in comparison to the reclaim being applied.
Perfect. We're going to segue into Hannah McIntyre's question, just because it kind of relates. It keeps moving on me, sorry. How often / much more will you continue to monitor the vegetation to determine plant community response over time?
So for my master's degree, it'll probably only be a couple of years. But ideally, we would like to keep monitoring these sites for longer than that, like 5 or 6 years, to see exactly what happens. It's like with the indaziflam, we aren't quite sure about the residual time and how long it's going to be there. So we want to see that. But yeah, for the master's degree, it'll only be 2 or 3 years per site.
Our next question is from Jody Best, and she is wondering how the chemicals used endure the fire treatment, particularly the esplanade that stays in the top layer of the soil. Does the fire remove the residual effect?
That's something we're really interested in. We know that the residual effect is reduced by fire in the broadleaf because any kind of heat will reduce the residual impacts. But the esplanade especially, we're not quite sure what's going to happen to it. I know there's been a little bit of research out of the States, but honestly, the research out of the States is such different environments that it's not always super helpful for us. I know some stuff that's gone on at the U of A about esplanade residuals that say it's lasting a lot longer, say in Alberta, than it does in the United States. So whether that's just a moisture or a temperature thing or microbial degradation or what, but yeah, I'm sure it's going to be impacted by the fire. We just don't know by how much.
our next question from Nolan Wallace kind of links to this one, and he was wondering if you know if there's any health concerns when burning herbicides and exposure to the smoke when completing the burn.
So because the burn should be completed pretty significantly after the herbicide application, the herbicide should be bound to the soil or in the ground. They should no longer be on the surface of the plants. So like we were discussing with the burn intensity, it's pretty low. We're not seeing a lot of organic matter from the soil going up. I'm not super worried about what is going on with the herbicides going up in flames. But I haven't seen a whole lot of research on it. I don't know if anybody's really looked at that.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Katherine. Our next question is from Ella Both, and she asks, do you have any results showing different vegetation responses from different herbicides used pre-fire?
So because of the way the plots are set up, we still have herbicides that are applied to unburned plots. So we've got herbicides that are applied to the burned plots and to the unburned, and we'll be able to look at the data when we actually get to the analyzing bit to see if there's any impacts unburned. So we don't have pre-burn data, but we have unburned data, if that makes any sense.
Perfect. Thank you. And our last question is from Ashton Poirier, and they ask, when is the burn planned for the knuqⱡi'it plot?
It's going to be hopefully very soon, weather dependent, but we're hoping for sometime in April. So like as soon as the weather and the conditions are right, then we're hoping to be burning.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katherine. That's the last of our questions that are in the Q&A box. If anybody has any questions that they still are wondering about, or if anybody wants to raise their hand. Oh, it looks like Mike Deedles has his hand up if Heidi. Perfect.
There we go. Thanks for unmuting me, and thanks to everybody for joining today. Very interesting presentation, Katherine. I learned a lot. I'm looking forward to going out to the knuqⱡi'its for our AGM at end April, early May, and joining with the CMI on their tour there and conference. So I encourage you to go to our website, www.bcgrasslands.org, and where you can see a registration link. And I'd like to thank Ashley and Heidi for doing a great job of hosting this session.
Yeah, they did great. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much, Mike. We did get another question in the chat from Jim Smith. Jim asks, are you going to have to keep deer, elk, and cattle from bringing in invasive seeds onto the sites if you plan to monitor for longer periods?
Well, because we really want to know for practical applications, if you were going to implement prescribed burns and herbicides over large areas, what would happen? I don't think we are going to try to keep the deer, elk, and cattle from bringing the invasive species on, because the reality is that if they're going to do it, it's going to happen no matter what. So we're not going to try preventing that. If it does happen, then that's good information to have. But ideally, if there's good native vegetation coming back, they shouldn't be bringing invasive species on.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Katherine. I have one from Anna Lomavatu, and she asks, what was your thought process in deciding to spray pre-burn versus post-burn?
There's a few things that go into that, and a lot of it just, I think, comes down to logistics. But I would say for things like cheatgrass, the pre-emergent aspect of it, we would want to be probably spraying pre-burn because we want to prevent the germination. If you try spraying post-burn, you're not going to be able to prevent germination. It's too late. But yeah, a lot of it just comes down to logistics and when we can get stuff done. And yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Katherine. Dawn Gayton asks, I have noticed that burns that consume litter down to bare soil tend to encourage cheatgrass germination. Have you noticed this?
100%. So the cheatgrass in the burns comes back thicker, and that's very well researched out of the States. After a prescribed burn or a wildfire, anything, the cheatgrass increases significantly. So that is one of the problems that BC is facing. We want to be doing prescribed burns because we have this tree and shrub encroachment, and we know it's good for the grasslands. But when you have invasive seed banks of cheatgrass and species like that, then you just know as soon as you burn, that's what's going to be coming back.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Catherine. I have one here from Roisin Cumming, and they ask, do you have a plan for managing the invasive plants that are regenerating?
So the plan, obviously in the spray plots, we're using spray to control them. Probably if in a few years we look at the unsprayed plots and say, wow, this is a big problem, then they might need to be sprayed too. But for research purposes, we do want to know if we didn't spray post-burn, what would happen. So immediately there's no plans to control the plants in the unsprayed plots, but it could happen.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Catherine. Is there any other questions from the floor? If anybody wanted to put their hand up, Heidi can unmute you.
I think there's a couple in the chat yet.
Oh, Lois Hill asks, has cheatgrass tended to increase with burning?
We did that one.
Yeah, we did that one. I think I've got all of them so far that were typed.
Oh, no. Mark Trudeau asked, is there any value in scaling up this research?
Sorry, Catherine.
Oh, yeah, I just scrolled up and saw that one. And I think there's a lot of interest in scaling up this research. Envu, that produces Esplanade, is really interested in that because they want to get it registered for rangelands. And there's a few other people that have mentioned they would really like to see larger scale studies like this. There's some going on in Alberta still on Esplanade. And yeah, I mean, prescribed burning is a big deal right now, and we're all interested in how that's going to play out, especially since some of the Jasper wildfire that we had recently, that's really driving home that we need to have these prescribed burns maybe on a more regular basis.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Give it a sec just to see if there is anybody else. It looks like Mike popped up with his webcam if you wanted to say anything, Mike.
Yeah, I already did give a thanks to the crew there, but Heidi just promoted me to be a panelist there, so I thought I'd join on again since we've got a few minutes. Again, yeah, having had a lot to do with invasive plants and wildfire over the years, I found this really interesting. The whole cheatgrass thing is really determining where we start considering using prescribed burns, and so it'll be interesting to see the outcome of this research. And sulfur cinquefoil, of course, is one that we don't have biocontrol for, so it's basically chemical is the option, and it'll be interesting to see what happens with wildfire there. So really interesting to hear this. I mentioned the AGM already, the Grasslands Council. Most of you are familiar with who we are. 2 years ago, we had our AGM in Williams Lake, and they had great tours out to Cotton Ranch looking at soil carbon there. Research, and last year we were in Kamloops and went to Lac du Bois and Tunqua Lake, and we haven't been out to the knuqⱡi'it for at least 8 or 10 years for our AGM, so really happy that we could join in with the Columbia Mountains Institute. They're doing all the legwork along with a great local committee to put together a fantastic conference for early May, and so they've got some great hotel rates there, so come join us in Kimberley. We look forward to seeing people there. And thanks again to Ashley and Heidi for doing great work on this. We look forward to the next one next week.
Thank you so much, Mike. Oh, we have a question from Kat McGlynn, and it says, knowing fungi and mycelium networks in soil forming beneficial relationships with native plants, is this a relationship that might be something to include within a study like this?
Yeah, I think that would be super cool. Obviously for me right now, that's probably a little bit beyond the scope of the research. But yeah, especially if you're looking at shrub and tree mortality, yeah, that would be, I think, really interesting. And I don't know much about fungi and what happens to them after burns, but I'm sure it has an impact of some kind.
Tyra Joe asks, what advice would you give to those thinking of prescribed burns in areas that may have established invasives? Any management suggestions when planning burns?
I mean, I think in a lot of areas, you've got to be looking at herbicides. Like, there's not a lot of other options. As far as dealing with invasives, especially ones that are fire adapted, if you aren't going to spray them, they're going to come back worse than ever after a prescribed burn. Obviously, there's people like BC Wildfire that have really good resources on this, and people that have done a lot of prescribed burns. But from what I've seen, yeah, like especially for species that don't have good options for biological control, or species like cheatgrass that are such a problem post-fire, like there's not a lot of options out there for dealing with that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Katherine. Perfect. So I'm going to give it back to Heidi here. It seems like we are done with the questions. And so Heidi will just wrap up the session. And thank you so much, Katherine. This has been a really, really interesting and impactful presentation. And I look forward to reading more about your research in the future.
Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Katherine. This has been such a great presentation, and you can just see it in the chat, right? All of the congratulations are flowing in, and it's really inspiring to see this work. You've given us a lot to think about when we're looking at grassland rehabilitation and invasive plant management, and everybody's favorite topic, which is fire. So I'm really excited to see how these insights can be directly applied to enhance our conservation practices, both at the GCC and in BC in general. Also, so much thanks to Ashley for introducing and moderating the Q&A session today, and for bringing your expertise. And for everybody who joined us today and supplied questions. I am just really grateful and happy to see the engagement that was here today. It was really lovely. I'd also just like to extend a special thank you to our GCC members. Your continued support makes important work like this possible. And if you're interested in supporting grassland conservation and being part of this community, we want to invite you to become a GCC member. You can find out more on our website. I'm just posting that in the chat, along with our AGM registration. And yeah, just thanks to everybody who joined us today and participated in the discussion. Please remember, we'll be continuing this series next week at the same time, but not in the same place. You need a different Zoom registration link, which you can find in the chat that I just posted. Next week, on April 3rd, we're going to be having Thomas Alexander from Thompson Rivers University sharing breaking news about rangeland monitoring with virtual fencing technology. So it's going to be an absolute thriller. Make sure that you're signed up. And yeah, just again, thank you everybody for joining today, and have a lovely rest of your day.